Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Rowe.
And I'm Nique Theodores.
And welcome to The Invisible Men, where we make the achievements of incredible men invisible no more. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Invisible Men. My name is Ian Rowe, a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute.
Hello, I'm Nique Theodores, a member of the Leadership Network at AEI.
And Nique, as always, great to see you. And as our viewers know, we love to highlight exceptional Black men who are doing amazing work that you may not be aware of. And we want to highlight and bring their works to the fore. And today we have the great honor of welcoming Theodore Johnson, or I know you like Ted, so I'll say Ted Johnson. So Ted, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so Ted, you have an amazing background. You're the director of the Fellows Program at the Brennan Center for Justice, a White House Fellow, 2 decades in the Navy. Thank you for your military service.
Thank you.
Most recently, you are the author of When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America. We can't wait to talk to you about that.
It'll be fun.
But as we start with all of our guests, just first tell us a little bit about you. Young Theodore. Before you had developed your own view of the world, were there any experiences that you had early that helped to shape your worldview?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thanks for having me on. And so I think it's probably three things that kind of come together that I think help folks understand how my worldview is shaped. The first is I am the grandchild of sharecroppers from South Carolina and Georgia. And my parents were first generation college graduates, spent 30 years each at IBM. And I was raised in the suburbs of Raleigh, North Carolina, in a predominantly white neighborhood for the vast majority of my life. So my parents are the first formative experience, if you can call it parenthood, that for me, because of their emphasis on education. My father is like a man's man. And so an introduction to what manhood looked like in practice, with all of its strengths and attributes, and even some of its pitfalls and things not to mimic. And my mother was brilliant, a mathematician in undergrad, again, lots of years at IBM, but her compassion and kindness to others is, along with her intelligence, sort of juxtaposed against my father's very hands-on, masculine way of grappling with the world. And so I took something of that from both of them, that the world was a thing to be wrestled with, and to try to bend to your will, with an understanding that intellect was required to make it happen, and that to the extent you could achieve success, that it was your responsibility to sort of not hoard it for yourself, but to ensure others had similar opportunities. The second was they were both very religious. And so I was raised in the Black church in North Carolina, which meant I was at church 4 times a week for Bible study, choir practice, youth night, and Sunday school /sermon/repast on Sundays. So that unyielding optimism and faith you find in Black churches is part of my core, as well as the sort of puritanical view of the world, and again with its attributes and shortcomings therein too, which a lot of focus on self-discipline, but an understanding that sometimes things aren't fair, and good work and smartness and good behavior is not going to get you where you want to go alone, that it requires other things. And then the last thing is growing up Black in a white neighborhood, and for a while I had to traverse these two worlds, where I was with my white friends at home in the neighborhood, and then at school with my Black friends who live mostly on the other side of town, and having to do the code switching that's required, but in much more intimate ways, not just for at the job and at home, but spending the night with the white kids in my neighborhood, and then spending the days at school, sort of going back between these two worlds. My church was Black, but my football team was mostly white. It's these kinds of things. So this is kind of where the book comes from: this unyielding faith in the American project, the understanding of the importance of hard work, and yet understanding it's often insufficient in and of itself, and a recognition of the role that race plays and how we navigate the world around us, especially in a country with a history like ours.
Wow, that's quite a duality. I'm curious, did your parents meet at IBM? Or
no, they met at Shaw University, an HBCU in Raleigh, North Carolina. They were, in their fraternity and sorority was sort of like the sister-brother relationship. And they met there in the early 70s and both went to work for IBM right after Shaw.
Wow. Wow. There's a whole story right there.
Whole story. That's right.
Whole story. Wow. So, okay. So then let's fast forward then. What led you, because clearly, your journey, the White House, your military service, there was a story bubbling up in you, it sounds like, and you felt the urge to tell it. What was that moment? What was the catalyst?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I tell folks that my life, which I try to put into the book in terms of personal and family narrative, it's kind of like the movie Slumdog Millionaire, where you pick up these little bits of knowledge throughout the years, and then eventually you come to this moment where suddenly all those little bits of useless knowledge are the thing that helps you ascend to the next stage, sort of make that transition. So there was no real moment. I went off to an HBCU for undergrad at Hampton University, and then off to the military, frankly, because the military was looking to diversify their officer corps, and they had a lot of money to throw around in doing that. So when they see this Black kid is a math major at an HBCU, that sort of checks multiple boxes. And so what was supposed to be a 4-year career in the military turned into just under 21 years.
Wow.
So I didn't grow up with this desire to be a military man, but I always grew up thinking that I had something more to offer than just upward mobility. Just aside from just trying to achieve the American dream of doing better than my parents had, I kind of felt like there was more happening, and I didn't know what that was really. The thing that helped me figure it out was actually the White House Fellowship. The application process is pretty arduous, lots of smart people. Your resume alone is not going to get you there. So all my military stuff and graduate degrees, none of that mattered, or it was par for the course, and I needed to figure out how to birdie the thing. Yep. And someone told me, you need to figure out what your story is. What are you going to tell the folks about yourself that's going to make who you are stick out in their minds? And I didn't have my story. And so I immediately turned to my name, and my full name is Theodore Roosevelt Johnson III. And so I, talked to my dad a little bit. I visited some scholarship and listened to some speeches, and the picture started to come together for me and help me understand why it was that my great grandparents, who were Black sharecroppers in South Carolina, decided to name their third son after a rich white New Yorker Republican president at the turn of the century. And it was because of his dinner with Booker T. Washington, who was it was the first time that a Black man had been invited to the White House to dine with the first family, not through the back door for political meetings and then ushered out through the back door like Frederick Douglass had been with Lincoln, but dining. And that dinner symbolized racial equality or some kind of social equality. A lot of white Americans were not happy about it, especially in the South, but a lot of Black Americans in the South were inspired by it, including my great grandparents, who was a kind of political strategy almost of naming their child after the sitting president. Actually, at the time he was born, Roosevelt was a former president by then, but they saw no irony in naming their child after a president, despite the fact they lived in Jim Crow, South Carolina. And I think it was their way of claiming the promise of America, claiming the country for themselves, despite all evidence to the contrary. And I like to think, and this may be the thing I tell myself to keep me going, that the trajectory of my life is some fulfillment of that faith, some answering of that dream from a century ago that they'd never lived to see. I didn't even live to see my grandfather, who was originally named Theodore Roosevelt Johnson. And so I've taken that mission on as a way of orienting the work that I do and the things that I write about.
You know, your commentary, Ted, reminds me of something that Glenn Lowry said on one of our earlier podcasts when we first launched, and that was, never bet against America. In the end, we win. And it's clear that your grandparents and your great-grandparents, they clearly were betting on America and believing in the end we would all win. Very powerful, very powerful story. So is that the lead in to and sort of the energy that led to you co-authoring the book?
Yeah, so the book is, I think so. Look, the book was supposed to be a deeper dive into the topic of my dissertation, which was about the political diversity within Black America that we never get to see exercised on election days, whether congressional or presidential, because of how uniform or nearly uniform the Black vote is in support of first Republicans once the franchise was granted to us, and now Democrats. And then Donald Trump won the 2016 election, and no agents or publishing houses cared about Black voters. It was all about the white rural voter and why, Trump country, what happened. So I had to expand the thesis a little bit and talk about the contributions that Black Americans have made to this country and how it's propelled the country to be a better version of itself. And so that's what kind of gave life to the book. My grandparents, my parents, my great-grandparents, they all had faith in the country, but it was almost because there was no alternative. The alternative was that the thing collapses on itself. And if you thought Black people were doing poorly under slavery and Jim Crow, just imagine when you've wiped out the idea that we're all created equal, or you've wiped out the unalienable rights that are granted to us in the Declaration and supposed to be further extended in the Constitution. If we don't have those things, those ideals, just imagine how rampant racism would run then. And so believing in those things, that led to Lincoln repurposing the Declaration to justify going to war with the states that seceded. Those are the documents that gave life to King's "I Have a Dream" speech. And so the rhetoric is more powerful than the men who bridled the potential of America for so long. And I think that the faith in the idea of America is the only thing on many, many days in the early part of the country all the way through now that has helped those who have been oppressed here see tomorrow and fight for a better tomorrow and a better a better nation for posterity. So and this isn't an uncritical belief in America. It's not an uncritical love of America. It chastises and then goes off and dies in wars for her. So it holds both ideas together, that you can serve a nation that is not delivering on its promise to you, but you're doing so because of your belief in the promise and your hope that the next generation will touch a little bit more of it than you were able to.
I saw a reference in some of the summaries of the book to the phrase "defeating racism," which I thought was I'm sure I've heard that phrase before, but it really struck me and grabbed me. Can you give us, one, a sense for what that means? And then two, Ian and I were chatting just before this conversation. Are there policymakers and politicians that you feel are pursuing this correct path to defeat it?
Yeah, and so it's interesting, and this is part of the book process, is that a lot of arguments that you spend a lot of time unpacking in the book get reduced to the sound bites. And so I absolutely believe in defeating racism, overcoming racism. But what I explain in the book is, by that I mean mitigating its effects. I don't know if we'll ever be able to get rid of racism entirely. I don't know if the human condition is such that it's possible. But I do believe we can mitigate its effects so that racism does not have exorbitant effects on my life chances or my experiences here. And so that's the goal. And I think we've been successful. We've not won the race, but as I've said in other places, I'm much happier being a Black man in 2021 than 1921 and certainly than 1821. So that is a sign of progress. And it is a sign that we can mitigate the effects of racism over time with good policy. I will be honest, though, and like policymakers today that I think have it just right, saying the right things, framing the issue correctly, looking to build coalitions instead of sort of demonize the other. It's very, very hard for me to find that person. I will say that probably my favorite person in Congress right now is Lauren Underwood out of Illinois, mostly because she is about the business of policy and doesn't really engage in a lot of the flaming rhetoric or I'm sorry, fiery rhetoric or divisive appeals. She just sort of puts her head down and does the work. And she almost didn't win re-election in her very purple district, I think because it was hard to distinguish where she sat on issues because she wasn't a firebrand. And it was, people had to sort of do the work of how does she vote and what does she believe, and to understand where she sat instead of just assuming that she was, super far left or more centrist. And so, but one of the things I call for in the book is transformative leadership, and the bench is thin right now at the national level. Here's the hope, and we get a few courageous and principled folks that will beat back the divisiveness that's happening politically and stand up for what's right.
Why do you think there's such a divide? It does seem there's some folk who, as it relates to race matters, there's some folks who are just almost, their narrative, it feels like we're fixed back in 1821 or that, and yet there are others saying, no, we've made progress, but we still have ways to go. But there's tension between these two things. Why?
Yeah. It's so politically, drawing stark contrast between you and your opponents is kind of good politicking. It's good electoral politics anyway. So folks are clear about who it is they're voting for. But what I don't like is the way race gets weaponized by both sides, frankly, and used as a way of saying, if you support this person, you're supporting a racist, or if you support this person, you're supporting a race-centric view of everything. And you can't talk about any issue without it boiling down to race and pointing out one side is for the racist outcome and one side is for the not racist outcome. And so simplifying race in that way is wholly unhelpful and actually leads to anti-democratic impulses in the nation that is more destructive for what we're trying to accomplish here than the conversation itself, the sort of the outcomes of it. But this is kind of how it's always worked. We don't, especially when it comes to race, we don't like having the long, nuanced, difficult conversations about it. It's much easier to just bumper sticker your opponent's position, put yourself in the opposite of it, and then go out and sell narratives that you're the good, whole, true American, and the other side is trying to destroy the country. I think one of the big issues is that our terms are getting mixed up now. And so when we say structural racism, institutional racism, systemic racism, critical race theory, anti-racism, like no one knows what these are words that are in the academy that have very specific meanings and were never intended to be discussed in public for those who've not studied these things to sort of weaponize them. But that's what's happening. And so I think one of the first things we can do before having any conversation about race is to standardize our language. And this is something we did in the military all the time. If I say, as I say in the book, that structural racism presents an existential threat to America, some people can hear that and say, oh, this guy thinks that, we're about to have another civil war, or that America is a racist nation and it's going to crumble and fall because it won't recognize white supremacy or white privilege. And that's not at all what the argument is. But you have to, when I talk about structural racism, when I talk about existential threats in America, defining America is not the nation state, but the idea, and thinking about, is racism compatible with equality? Of course not. And so, of course, if racism prevails, then we have actually lost the American idea, which is why racism is an existential threat to it. But you have to be willing to engage at that level, to make yourself vulnerable, to be willing to sacrifice and practice forbearance in engaging these topics and other people if you really want to make progress on the race question. And frankly, I just don't think we have enough in our leadership that are willing to do that kind of hard, nuanced work to bring people together and not to tear us apart.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, I'll certainly be purchasing your book without question. I've got a long trip coming up. I'll be adding this to my. I'll need to check some additional luggage just for all the books I have. But it sounds really important. It's troubling though that in your research and analysis and thoughtful examination of the issue, you don't see a lot of voices in the world that are mapping against solutions. But so we have a section of the conversation that we call the speed round, Ted, where I will offer up different individuals, maybe different philosophies, ask you to pick one and tell us why. We'll start with our standard bearer, which is Malcolm or Martin.
Yeah, this is a tough one, but I will go with Martin on this one, mostly because he repurposed the language of our framers and showed how it was compatible with racial equality and compatible with government putting forth policies that move us toward the promise of America instead of away from it. Martin was important because he was a truth. He made people sit with very uncomfortable truths. And while Martin Luther King didn't avoid the truth, Malcolm was he punched you in the face with it, and that's necessary sometimes. But for my style, it's not really where I'm at. Even though I recognize the utility and in the approach. Ultimately, though, the two came together and recognized that they're kind of fighting for the same thing with different tactics. And even Malcolm toned it down some, and then Martin stepped his up some before he was assassinated. But on the whole, I think the King approach is probably more aligned to mine, or I'm more aligned to his, rather.
Civil rights or economic development?
Yeah, civil rights, without a doubt. I am a firm believer in unleashing Black ingenuity and talent and allowing folks to be able to be self-determining. But I'm also a believer that if government doesn't protect folks' rights when they're violated or infringed upon, then there's no amount of economic ingenuity or talent that will overcome a group or a nation's willingness to tear that economic power down. And this is what Eddie Glaude at Princeton calls the value gap. As long as there are groups in our society that are not valued the same as other groups, then the policies you put forward are probably going to reproduce inequality because of the gap in value. And I think civil rights protections are the best way to ensure people's rights are protected so that they can be freed up to be economically successful.
Well, that is a very thoughtful answer to those two choices. I appreciate that. And finally, free speech or free enterprise?
Speech. Yeah, speech. And some of this is because the markets are incredibly valuable, both to a society and economically, and sort of all the acumen that goes along with those things. But they do not care about people. They are clinically, their calculus is cold. Whereas speech requires voice. It requires you giving people space to voice themselves, their opinions, their views. And while those views may not win the day, creating space for people's ideas and their agency, I think, is incredibly important and precedes the ability to have and protect free enterprise.
Thank you, Ted. Great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're coming to the end, but I want to go back just for a moment to your introduction, because I'm really struck by how some key institutions played a role in your own life. So you started talking about your parents. They were married. It clearly seems like there was a strong foundation to start. Then it sounds like a religious commitment was extremely important. Then on top of that, education clearly. And I wonder how you think about the role of the cultural institutions. There's racism, but where does our investment, our in the Black community, investment in those particular institutions that were so crucial to your development, where does that play in the spectrum of how we approach racism, how we diminish the role of race? Are those forces so big that those are actually the answer to address some of these perennial issues. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think the Black church, the education gospel, like these were things that Black folks felt they needed to make it through tomorrow and then to do better the day after. And so you needed education to get out of the hood or off the farm or wherever. You needed faith in something bigger than what was happening in your immediate circumstances to latch onto, to sort of the star that would carry you forward. The family was where you received your emotional support, your financial, economic stability. But what we're seeing over the last, I don't know, maybe 50 years or so is a lack of faith in these same institutions and churches. And it's not unjustified. I mean, like there's a reason the Black church with mega churches and sort of the prosperity gospel sometimes gets the message off track. And education, where you leave with a college degree, but now the market doesn't really have a place for you, or the salary's not right, especially when you've got 6 figures worth of debt to get there. So, but I don't think the answer is burn down those institutions or disempower them, and including the family, the church, school, the military, and find something else. I think the answer is the set of challenges we're facing now are not Jim Crow. And so what are the institutions that will help us push the nation closer to the promise of tomorrow? And I think institutions are still the answer. I just don't know if they're the same institutions from before, but whatever the new ones are, they will provide the same things as those institutions did: stability and faith and a means by which to be better than you are. I've seen studies that suggest the reason things like bowling leagues and Cub Scouts and churches are seeing dwindling membership is one is because we're much more transient as a population than we were. And those things require, you be in an area. Finding a new church is difficult. Finding friends and leagues are difficult. So what are those smaller, transient, more malleable institutions that we could latch onto? Are they fraternities and sororities? Are they, yoga clubs or running clubs or, book clubs? I don't know, but I think we have to find out what the present generations, really the under 45 crowd, what are the institutions that give them purpose and meaning and connection to society, and then figure out how to wield those things to provide the things that traditional institutions used to provide, but now folks are no longer seeking in those places, but are looking for the same thing in other places.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, unfortunately, social media is often playing that role, and it's empty. It's emptiness what it's delivering.
Right.
So maybe on that note, this is as we talked about, Nique and I came up with this idea a long time ago to create this idea of the invisible man, to talk to young men like Daryl, the 16-year-old who lives in forgotten USA, Black kid who's trying to make his way in the world. If he were to pick up a copy of your book and he's trying to decide, like, how is he going to forge his path, what would you say to him, given the complexities of where young people in particular face these days?
Yeah, I would tell him to optimize all things in the span of his control, and that that's not going to be fair. He is not going to have opportunities that other people in other places are going to have. He's not going to have resources that other people in other places have, but he does have agency in his sphere. Whatever that looks like, and then optimize all of that stuff. The people, the institutions, the opportunities as they present themselves, and then don't do it just for material gain, but have something more at the core of who you are as a person that's driving you. And so if we tell young Black men, do well in school so you can make 6-figure job and get a pretty wife and have a house out in the suburbs, that's the wrong motivation in my view. Instead, optimize all of the opportunities within your span of control, whatever they may look like, and do it because of something. If you don't like the conditions in your neighborhood, then optimize those things so that when you're in a position to make change, you can change it for the next generation. If you don't like the way the other nations treat the United States, or if you don't like the way the school system, your school system operated, or you're fascinated by technology and you're looking for ways to improve communities or opportunities or start your own business, whatever it is, then allow the principle of the thing you're interested in drive you, and not like the material gain from excellence be the thing that drives you. I will be honest with you, though, if someone had told me that at 16, I don't know if I would have been ready to receive it. And because frankly, my parents told me that at 16, and I did well in school because I had to, or it was, there was corporal punishment awaiting if I didn't. And I also did it because I wanted to make them proud. And so this is sort of where I'll wrap up. The last thing I would say is find the person you admire, whoever that is, school teacher, parent, uncle, cousin, whoever, and then work to make them proud. And if you do that, then you will position yourselves to capitalize on future opportunities as they arise. And when you have a better understanding of what you want to do with your life.
Wow. Very wise words. Yep. Meeting the aspirations of someone that you respect and have a great amount of admiration for can be very inspiring and a great motivation.
Yeah.
Dr. Theodore Johnson. Author of a great new book. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining this episode of The Invisible Men. If our viewers would like to see other episodes, you can go to www.invisible.men. And my name is Ian Rowe.
I'm Nique. Ted, thank you so much. I mean, you are a case study example of why this show exists. I'm thrilled to have entered your sphere, and I certainly will be monitoring the contributions you make to America, and starting with this book, which I'll definitely be getting. And thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you both.
And it's when the stars begin to fall, overcoming racism and renewing the promise of America. Thank you. Thank you for watching another episode of The Invisible Men. You can find other episodes at the AEI podcast channel on YouTube, or the website invisible.men, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.